It is such a pleasure to have these amazing speakers. Manuel is having a health emergency situation, so he sent us a video, and we will begin with playing the video. So this is why we are three as speakers on the stage. So this panel wants to reflect on the fact that the world obviously is currently shattered in so many places, and active dissent and resistance movements are simultaneously emerging in all its corners, right? Where you have pain, there's resistance. Where you have oppression, there's resistance. So we want to ask, what lessons can we draw from these movements, from the perspectives of those who monitor them, analyze them, and participate in them? Because many of us are both academics and activists, right? From protests against Russian interference and occupation in Sakartvelo-Georgia to queer feminist decolonial movements in Qazaqstan, the strengthening alliances between Russian imperialism and the American far right, and the dissonances between decolonial debates and praxis in Ukraine and Latin America, how should we approach the local and global dimensions of civil resistance movements, their broader socio-political implications, intersections, and tensions? What are some of the effective approaches to speaking across divides and connecting different liberation struggles in ways that will build more widely supportive communities and solidarities? How can we communicate and share our knowledge in a manner that will not only support dialogues and mutual learning, but also the implementation of justice in the Ruta regions and across the world? So these are some of the main questions that we want to ask. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers. On my left is Maia Barkaia, who is an associate professor at the Georgian Institute of Public Affairs. She holds a bachelor's degree in Oriental Studies, an MA in Modern Indian History, and a PhD in Gender Studies. These academic backgrounds have shaped her research and teaching interests, which center on post-colonial and gender studies. She is the founder of the New Movement for Social Democracy and an elected member of its board. She is also the co-editor with Elise Watterson of Gender in Georgia, Feminist Perspectives on Culture, Nation, and History in the South Caucasus, published in Berkhan Books. So we're very happy to have you. Manuel Férez, who sent us the video, is a doctoral researcher at the University Alberto Hurtado in Santiago de Chile, and has taught classes and courses on the Middle East and the Caucasus at various universities in Mexico and Chile. His academic research focuses on ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities in the Middle East, Caucasus, and Europe, specifically their processes of memory and intergenerational identity transmission. Previously, he coordinated the Jean Monnet Chair in European Studies at International University of Cuernavaca in Mexico. And then we have Zhanar Sekerbayeva, who is one of the co-founders of the Kazakhstan feminist initiative Feminita. She is a fierce lesbian, feminist, powerlifter, and poet. Zhanar graduated with summa cum laude from the Gumilev, am I pronouncing it right? Eurasian National University in 2005. In 2014, she enrolled at the European Humanities University in Lithuania MA program in sociology with focus on gender and culture, and finished at the University of Tsukuba, Japan, a PhD program in 2020. And she worked on trans community in Kazakhstan and state policies shaping trans identities and bodies. Recently organized and successfully had the first lesbian, you will have to pronounce this.
Kurultai.
Thank you, in Central Asia. Zhanar was recently arrested for 10 days for a one-year-old protest against femicide in Kazakhstan on May 13, 2024. Her arrest was political. The government tried to isolate activists before 8th of March on International Women's Day, so we will be talking about that. And then we have Terrell Starr, who's an independent journalist based in Ukraine, whose work helps non-experts understand world politics and why we should care. His expertise focuses on Ukraine and Eastern European politics, as well as communicating foreign policy issues in accessible ways. He is behind the YouTube channel Terrell Starr, previously black diplomats. I think a lot of us enthusiastically watched those videos. He has covered the Russian invasion of Ukraine, US elections, also elections in Georgia. He has been around Central Asia, Moldova, and Baltic, and he also followed the situation and struggles of black refugees in the middle of Russian invasion of Ukraine and sort of displacement and what was happening around that. So we definitely need to know more. And now I want to start our discussion. Terrell is also doing a lot of work that is kind of translation between different contexts, particularly, especially US and Ukraine. You do the kind of work that also is trying to speak to more lay audiences in accessible ways, which is not always our forte as academics, so we can learn a lot from that. You were saying you have been coming to Ukraine since 2008, so you know a lot of years, and these two contexts between US and Ukraine seem to be worlds apart right now. They're really growing more and more apart, with Trump siding with Russia while increasingly building his own fascist regime, basically. Can you tell us about how you perceive these developments and what are the things we need to understand about them better that we might not be aware of now?
Yeah. Speaking about current developments right now, well, essentially, currently Trump, people refer to him as an isolationist, and I think that's a really disrespect to isolationism as an ideology, because as much as I disagree with isolationism as a policy, there is some thought into it, and there is established framework in which these people have intellectually thought through what a country's relationship would be with its neighbors and the rest of the world if they take on the isolationist approach. Trump is just selfish. So, you know, to give him this academic term with rigor would suggest that he himself has rigor, and neither he nor any of the people who follow him has that. So I just want to establish that standpoint. But above all, Ukraine has always been viewed through this lens of a beggar, through someone, through a country that siphons away from America. When I say siphon, read white America. And so there is a way in which Ukrainians are considered the new welfare queen of America. And for those who don't know, the welfare queen is a term that was popularized by Ronald Reagan to target black people in America. And it's always this black woman who is on welfare, who has 10 children, and who drives in the Cadillac because she fraudulently exploits the government. And so Donald Trump Jr. literally referred to Ukraine as an international welfare queen, which is a very racialized term. What is the challenge, however, in going to the larger conversation I think we really need to have is that Ukrainians are very much, I think for the first time, it's the quote unquote kind of white people, and whiteness, their whiteness is kind of weaponized against them in a sense. And I know that sounds really strange, but that part of the reason is that we don't talk about race enough in these conversations, and that how Ukrainians are kind of racialized with these very racist terms that were really just assigned towards black people. And so you have Trump targeting roughly 250,000 Ukrainians who are in the United States on through a refugee program. And part of that reason is because Ukrainian whiteness doesn't serve them. However, white Afrikaner whiteness serves the Trump administration, because what it does is that it fuels Trump's white supremacist agenda. And the toughest problem that I have as somebody who's devoted my life to understand, is I actually learned in Georgia, where I really started to understand the effects of Russian colonialism, is that Ukrainians have to make a really important step, which is they suffer from this Russian supremacist Ruski Mir environment. However, when they step outside of that world, they integrate into whiteness. And because Ukrainians integrate into whiteness, they will never build these cross-cultural solidarity moves because they've made a choice to fit in with other people's colonizers, which makes it really difficult for said colonized peoples in South America and elsewhere to build solidarity with them because they built solidarity with a colonizer, and then you're asking us to defend you against your own. That's where we are.
Thank you. That's really important critical reflection that we will need to sit with, right? Also across the couple of the next days. Now, Maia, we already mentioned Georgia. You came here all the way from Sakartvelo, that has been going through a very tough time. You've just had your election stolen by the pro-Russian so-called Georgian Dream, and you have been having such mass protests against this illegitimate government. Now, today it's 212 days, every single day. In so many ways, the Georgian people are so impressive in showing up, so much for freedom and democracy that it is incredible, and in other ways, it must be so exhausting and difficult to face how one society is being pulled down by an increasingly authoritarian government. And in our conversations leading up to Ruta, you were pointing out that a whole set of new politically oppressive laws are coming into power. Can you tell us more about what is happening? It feels like we can also have a hard time following up, as a lot of what is going on in Georgia does not make our news. Can you tell us what you're going through and what the stakes are? And this is just so you know, we make this kind of catch up on what's happening in each and every context, and then we go deeper.
Thank you for inviting me. And actually what's happening in Georgia is a question we as Georgians also ask ourselves, because we have found ourselves living under the authoritarian and repressive regime, which was kind of, everything happened very suddenly and fast. I would say the turning point probably was Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, when we first noticed this kind of shift in the approach of the government, and it coincided with the EU association agreement kind of negotiations and talks, which also implied some kind of democratic conditionality, which scared the ruling party, Georgian Dream, who at that point already slowly began to its grip on the country and began to eliminate any checks on its power. So it began slowly, but then during the last 1 year, they adopted very fast a set of laws which came into action, we could say slowly, but after June 1st, it's even a next stage we are in. So I would mention first the first law, which was Foreign Agents Law, which targeted organizations who receive more than 20% foreign funds. They were supposed to register as foreign agents. So there were protests in 2023 and then in 2024, last year, for several months. And it was, I would say, quite impressive in terms of mass mobilization. However, they still adopted the law last year in 2024. But the thing is that at that point last year in May, June, we were hopeful. We were hopeful because we were waiting for the elections in October. And it was a false hope that left us inactive without action, because we hoped that things should definitely change after the elections. And then elections happened, and it was stolen, rigged. So after the elections, I would say there was a stage of total hopelessness, but more than that, it was kind of a melancholia, that kind of melancholia that leaves you paralyzed and without action, because we went out to the streets, but few people, and we felt that we should prepare for something, for long term, for 3 years. We should organize, we should meet each other and like mobilize each other and work for a long term change. So it was a more kind of a stage of hopelessness, and then suddenly on November 28, what happened, it's a third stage, the final stage, which we are in, is that the Prime Minister announced that it suspends all the negotiations with EU. So it was, I would say, this last straw on the camel's back that brought thousands and tens of thousands of people at 11 p.m., 12 a.m., middle of the night, to the streets. So for 1 month, I think in December, the mobilization was quite high, but it was horizontal, spontaneous, because as you know, in Georgia, we do have the Georgian Dream and the oppositional parties, but in terms of oppositional parties, many people, there's a third huge group which is dissatisfied with both, but they still voted for the opposition just in order not to vote for Georgian Dream. So there are these three groups: pro-government, opposition supporters, and the third group which is not happy with either of them, but fighting for democracy. So when it comes to the streets now, it's quite horizontal. There are different organized groups, movements, who coordinate with each other, but it's not a coalition in a way. And there is a formal also process going on with the political parties, and some doubt that such kind of mobilization without a leader could lead to any kind of political change. But I think that it's to the advantage of the protests that it does not have leaders, because as we see, the political leaders are either imprisoned, and last week 4 of them were like sentenced for 8 months for not, and it's still going on. And also with political leaders, they can be negotiated and so on, while with this chaotic but still organized and coordinated movement, it's difficult to find the leader and to find someone to kind of bargain power with. And when it comes to the laws which we are now living under, so first of all, which targets everyone now, not just organizations, but individuals, academics, and me being here also, we all are now lawbreakers in Georgia. But just one thing I want to mention is that all this was preceded by the campaign of dehumanization, demonization of civil society and NGOs. Of course, when it comes to NGOs and mainstream developmentalist path, we can be critical of this as being part of this, and we have been critical. But I would say from 2010, there are different groups in Georgia, be that formal, informal, ideological different, so on. And in Georgia, civil society has learned how to navigate and how to foreground local agenda in this kind of environment. So apart from this criticism, what happens that the Georgian Dream government targeted NGOs, demonized them, dehumanized them, and as a witness to this, if we compare surveys from 2021 and 2024, you see that in 2021, for instance, among the pro-government supporters, 25% of them distrusted NGOs, and it shifted and increased drastically this year to 40%. So you see the shift in trust and distrust towards NGOs. And another thing is that the government used these repressive measures before when it comes to other subaltern groups or oppressed groups. So for instance, in Pankisi, where Muslim population resides, in 2017-18, this region has been a target of the similar repressive measures, and an 18-year-old boy was killed in his bed while sleeping. So all this happened, and it again used this demonization, dehumanization in order to use its repressive measures. But now what we see is that now whole protest is criminalized. We see the subalternization of the whole protest, and now everyone is lawbreaker in a way that even wearing a mask when you are going to the protest is banned now. The fines are increased for blocking roads and so on. And so now we see how every night people still come, not that many as in December, but still come to the street, and we are managing to block the road from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. at least every night. But everybody wears masks, but this is interesting because these masks, also we wear them, we are able to recognize each other, but the cameras are not able to recognize us. So it's kind of creates this collective kind of, it's a collective strategy to avoid this kind of criminalization. However, when it comes to FARA, we all fall under this because individuals, if you not only receive fund, but if you go to some conference and speak and criticize the government, and then government considers when you go back that you have political interests in a way that your political statements might interfere into the election or pre-election process, you might fall under FARA. So, which is a Foreign Agent Registration Act, and if you don't register, you're fined first for 4,000, and then if you still don't register, that it's punishable by around 5 years. So, in this way, and then protest is banned through these increased fines, and within first 10 days, over 338 protesters were arrested. Some of them have been sentenced for like 17, 18 years old protesters to 6, 7 years old. And then there is this journalist also, a famous case, who has been arrested in February still for slapping a police officer, and if found guilty, like 7 years of prison awaits her for insulting the police officer. So all this, along with electoral changes they made, now no observer can verify ID card or so, and this was one of the tactics they used to steal the elections last year. And then financial cuts when it comes to the fines to the protesters. What they did, they freezed all the accounts of those who helped protesters to pay the fine. So it's, and then you have the, but maybe this is overall kind of, I just enlisted few of the laws which we are now being that, but I should mention maybe the media as well, media restrictions, and this funding policy affects them. First of all, but when it comes to the political kind of statements and news coverage, media can't record or video record or audio record now the processes in the court. They don't have access to the parliament. So it's the transparency is the issue, the financial resources are cut, the political censorship is there, and it's difficult even now to find any loophole in these laws because we are beyond the constitutional order. The old kind of order does not work, and we have to find new ways to navigate through this.
Thank you, and we will later come to how we can support you in all of this, because what you're raising is really concerning. Zhanar, you were recently released from wrongful detention, and as we read in your bio, you were arrested so that you could not lead the International Women's Day March, which is both impressive that you're so powerful that the system fears you this much. We're very happy to have you on this panel because we can learn a lot through that. But it's also very outrageous, of course, that you and fellow protesters are being repressed in such wrongful ways. And I think a lot of us don't know enough about what is happening in Kazakhstan. So we were once together also at a feminist conference in Istanbul, and you were explaining that the political establishment fears especially queer feminist activists because you lead decolonization. And this is in a country that has been decolonizing itself from the USSR and Russian colonialism, and yet now Kazakhstan fears queer feminists and your decolonial politics. So can you help us understand this kind of situation? Why is queer feminist decolonization so scary for Kazakh politics? That it persecutes people like you for the justice-oriented work that you do.
Thank you. Yes, so I think queer feminists were not recognizable as serious actors, especially political actors, before probably 2021. When we had in 2021 our first legally permissioned meeting, because in Kazakhstan you have to apply special paper, and if you have a permission, you can go to streets. This is a practice. In theory, there is no such thing. So in theory, the law on peaceful assembly says that you can go at street and protest. This is your constitutional right. But in practice, it is different. So we have our very first, from 2017, our very first legally, held with protective policemen. It was really wow. They were protecting for the first time feminists. So we were really, really amazed by the fact that government actually can go and shake hands with us. But it was just 1 year for our remembrance. And then in 2022, Bloody January happened in Kazakhstan, unrest, which our president, named it as 20,000 people, bandits, mob terrorists who just came for something they even don't know. Of course, that was not true, and this depiction of people who go to protest in January 2022 is something that our Kazakhstani people never forgive. We will never forgive that kind of evaluation of the protest where many people came and many of them were poor. And that is why, yes, they broke shops and took what? They didn't took jewelry. They took food and actually sneakers. That's it. They were poor. But they were called terrorists. And from that moment, I think many Kazakhstani people did understand that Tokayev actually is just somebody who graduated from the teacher, and whose teacher? Nazarbayev. So one autocrat teaches another autocrat, and we have now second autocrat, who even doing something really tough politics to close shouting activists' mouths, because he don't want to say, oh, it was my fault. Of course, these people is, just usual people who did protest. So in 2022, because of that big unrest, and because of the order of president to shoot people without any warning, this is a violation of international law. A lot of innocent people were killed, including a 4-year little girl, for example. She was shot by a sniper gun. If you use sniper gun, it means you are targeting, you're fixing your target, and you killing the person. So they use snipers to kill people in protest. And we did understand from that moment, no, actually it was a turning point to understand our country would not be new Kazakhstan as Tokayev claimed. So, and because of that, any protest after 2022 or in 2022 were recognizable as something dangerous. That is why queer feminist activists, when we applied again very properly, A+ students for 8th of March rally, we were denied because of that experience in February. Because they said, no, you cannot just march at street because it's dangerous. You forgot Bloody January. You forgot all these tortures. We did not. And that is why we were asking the permission for doing these protests. We were denied in 2023, we were denied in 2024 and 2025, so nothing changed. And from that moment, I think they really recognized that queer feminists actually, they shouting some slogans which are triggering government. We were shouting not only about gender equality, no. We were shouting about political events. We were shouting, recognizing the torture of people who went to Bloody January. We were shouting about atomic electrostation plan to make them in Kazakhstan. So now we will have 3. One of them would be built by Russian Federation. It's so shameful. So we were shouting about, because when we say feminist, and of course you have some kind of image, yes, of course your rights should be protected, but we also were shouting about LGBTQI, we were shouting about workers of Zhanar, we were shouting about mothers of many children. We were shouted about many things, and this triggers government. So they decided, no. Now they focusing on many things that triggers us. Even on Ukraine, Palestine, we don't like it. So now they deny every time, even if you write event dedicated to femicide, they did not recognize it. They say, no, we will have another meeting. We have other participants who can go and do, how to say it's Congo. They replace you and do very peacefully, not going out of agenda, just, you know, shouting about maybe values of men and women, and so on and so on. So this is what we become. And I think they really did understand that for queer feminists, we have nothing to lose because we are raised in the environment where we say very honestly and sincere and sharply what is wrong with the country. And because of that, of course, we recognized as a, I think, political movement.
Thank you so much. This clarifies a lot of things that we can later go deeper into. Now, back to Terrell. Building on what you said, for a lot of us who have been quite avidly following your reporting, and especially the work on the interconnections of the Black and Ukrainian struggles for justice and liberation, I remember in a number of your videos and interviews, you have been saying that actually the Black people and Ukrainians have quite a lot in common in terms of experiences with some forms of subjugation or just their existence, right? But now you were also saying about how that works when the moment you leave and you go elsewhere and you can somehow blend into whiteness and get that privilege, right? A lot of Eastern Europeans have that possibility unless, you know, you are Roma, as we discussed, for example, this morning. You don't have that. So it's more complex as well. But when we think also internally, right, there still is racial injustice within Ukraine itself and within Eastern Europe, as in many other places, in particular places that are white dominated. So I wanted to maybe say a bit more also about this. What are the things that you would like us to be more aware of and actively engaged with? That, for example, you do a lot of public speaking, you have conversations, you're inviting people to be reflective of this to, you know, various levels of success. What do you see there as like some of the major issues that you want us to know? I will give you the mic. Your voice carries, but still.
Understood. So here's how we can start to have a constructive conversation. First, we don't know jack shit about each other. Let's just make it simple, right? I've spoken to Ukrainian audiences who say the most ignorant, dumbest shit about Black people and anyone who isn't white. I've heard Black people have ignorant, dumb assumptions about Ukrainians. So that's the foundation that I start. No one knows anything about each other. And particularly speaking to Black Americans, right? I'll tell you my first experience of kind of like I had to, before we could talk about decolonization, I think we all have to go through this larger conversation of decolonizing our own minds, of our own ignorance and our own biases, because we all have them. When I went to Georgia, I was a Peace Corps volunteer, first Black person to kind of graduate to finish my Peace Corps service. And it was one of the first times that I learned that Caucasian, which is often used in America, is not truly used correctly in America because the real Caucasians are in the Caucasus Mountains. And that's really important context because when I went there, being a Black American, a lot of the Georgians would tell me about the time that there were times that they were going to Moscow to work. And they said, well, Terrell, they call us N-word. They call us, black asses, all these Russian terms to describe Georgians. And I'm 21, 22 years old, and I'm thinking, okay, these people are saying, Terrell, they kind of treat us like Black people. I'm like, no, you're not. You're clearly not Black. You're not any of these things, right? So just imagine this person. I'm growing up. I'm looking at what I think is like looking at a white face telling me that they are called all these Black racial slurs. So my point is that it took that lived experience for me to realize that race does not function in the way that I think that it does globally. It functions the way that it functions in the United States and in the Western world, but in Georgia, these people that we would ordinarily consider white in our world don't function that way in the Ruski Mir. So when I bring up the Ruski Mir dynamic, it's like you have to explain to people that there are more types of oppressive systems than the Western one, which is what a lot of liberal, far left-leaning people in the West don't understand or refuse to comprehend. And so I have the advantage of having this lived experience. And so that's what people listen to. All these kind of esoteric terms that we use to talk with each other, that's very important. I've undergone the pedagogy of graduate school. However, when I talk to the average American who doesn't have access to these rooms, they need a story that they can relate to, and what they understand is some kind of shared struggle. And I set up these frameworks, first of all, to begin a dialogue of what it can look like. That's most important, because they're, unlike with black people in Ferguson, there's a strong decades-rich history with black protesters and Palestinians who, in the Ferguson uprisings, the Palestinians taught the black activists how to wash their eyes with tear gas. There is no existing relationship between black people and Eastern Europeans, even though not one that people can rely on when things get tough, as is the case with Palestinians and black people. So what I do is, one of my favorite parallels is drawing a parallel between the Ferguson movement and that of Maidan in Ukraine. And one of the similarities is that both of these movements resulted in extreme police violence. That's the other thing. And so what you teach people is that, yes, these quote unquote white Ukrainians are brutalized. They were brutalized by police, and there is the Heavenly 100 that is in Kyiv that speaks to that experience. And so you really have to discombobulate people's minds about how white people suffer under oppression and use that term assigned to them. Secondly, it was the use of social media that gave both the Maidan movement and the Black Lives Matter movement the agency to speak, to tell their narrative in a way that mainstream media refused to do. And one of the main things you saw through the Maidan, for example, was insisting that the Associated Press spell Kyiv properly, right? Something simple. Black people have gone through that same thing. One of the reasons why I was a political correspondent for so many years was a direct result of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And I think that just drawing those two parallels of two pivotal movements that happened in the same year can get us to have a conversation, because that's the foundation where it needs to begin. What is really critical for us to take away from these conversations, however, is that we all, I think for black people, Georgians, and I've had similar conversations, is that we have to understand how we each individually and as individual peoples are functioning within these supremacist structures. Because we all have a role that we didn't choose. So when I talk to Black Americans specifically, I want to focus on that. There are two things that are true. Yes, Ukrainians, I always describe as an oppressed people who are being targeted through genocidal actions. However, because of the world in which we live in, our structures are defined by race and including whiteness. So you could be oppressed here, but integrate into whiteness once you leave this context. And the way that I kind of make it a bit more comfortable for people to comprehend, I say, look, I am a black man. However, being a black man does not mean that I cannot participate in sexism, right? I don't get to choose that, right? This is a structure. So what I need to do, as opposed to getting personal and someone getting upset with me about it, I need to accept that as a man, I am eligible to participate in sexism, whether I want to or not. People who are, Ukrainians, Russians, etc., they're eligible to participate in whiteness, whether they want to or not. And the privilege comes when you feel like you don't. And I think that is the major issue that I've had on the Ukrainian side. And so that's why I start off with these parallels, because parallels and struggles are important for us to realize that we do have a foundation that we can work and build from, as opposed to it being contentious. And so my takeaway for this, for all of you, is to, like with my work that I do, I'm less concerned, I'm really concerned with how people can self-reflect even through pain. Because as Black people, we've always been asked to constantly elevate ourselves, improve ourselves, and work through our pain and recognize our trauma. What these larger structures, the Russian structure, Russian supremacist structure, white supremacist structures do not want us to do is to realize is that we're all oppressed. And what large structures want us to do is to identify our individual privileges within these structures so that they can remain intact. And so my work really focuses, the journalism I do when I interview people, I touch on these things in my interviews to show that Ukrainians are thinking about this, Georgians are thinking about this. And one last note, as I've grown to expand my own knowledge of supremacist networks, I spend a lot of time in Central Asia. I primarily go to Uzbekistan. And first, a lot of people think I'm Muslim because I have my beard, but what I found interesting, it was being a Black person going through Central Asia, in addition to being a brother, because people assume that I'm Muslim, and even when I'm not, people still invite me to mosque and all these other things, like constantly. But I'll tell you something that really stood out to me. I was in a town, it was in the Fergana Valley in Uzbekistan, and the guy, he took me to a museum, and it depicted how the Soviets took over, not the Soviets, but the Russian czars took over in the late 1800s. And one of the things that they did was that they cut the people's beards. Arabic was a predominant language. It was replaced by Russian. And as the museum went on, it started going into the Soviet era, and it talked about the fact that these Uzbeks were sent disproportionate to their population to the to the World War II in order to die. And I think it was another continuation of even how Asian people were a part of this larger colonial project, because much of Russia that we know today is not indigenous Russian land, which was another expansion of that knowledge. And so when you bring all these things together, you really help people to really understand that outside of my own structure of oppression, there are these other people. And if we really learn to combine those things together and lead in those types of conversations, then what has been established with, say, Palestinians and Black people can also establish between us. But we have to really, particularly with the Ukrainian, I find, it's like to realize that they do possess a whiteness once they leave their environment. And that's going to be the biggest challenge, because I think Black people are more open to what that could look like than many Eastern Europeans across the board at this point.
Thank you so much. That gives us, I think, a lot of really important food for thought. And I was just thinking, when I have a lot of conversations with people about this, I sometimes also sense that we have this tendency to think that, like, not being actively racist is enough, but you actually need to be actively anti-racist to create environments that actually, start sort of working towards racial justice. And this is something that I think a lot of us, yeah. Yeah. Other non-oppressed people are in the room that they're racism when they say it, telling them that they are wrong. Yeah. So, thank you for this guidance. We will definitely take it on. Now I'm losing my precious notes. Maia, back to Georgia. One of the many things that are really remarkable when we see the Georgian protests is that academics have been playing a very active role in them while facing very real risk of arrest, torture, and persecution. With Ruta, we have been very keen to support you from afar. We have published an open letter in support of Georgian academics, and this goes to everyone in this room. If you have not signed it yet, please do. It's important that our Georgian colleagues know that they are not alone and that we support them. Can you tell us more about the role and position of Georgian academics right now, and if there's anything in particular that we can do better to support you?
Thank you. The protest actually against the authoritarian turn of the government took different forms, and different professional groups, including academics, they are in the vanguard of the protest. So when it comes to the academia, there are political and economic threats, of course, both, and because academics in Georgia rarely have the privilege to just do teaching. Most of them are multi-professionals, and most of them, they are activists, they're politically active, they do work in NGOs, and when it comes to research, the only research foundation in Georgia, and most of them, they apply abroad for research grants, which means that they will fall under this FARA legislation. But secondly, when it comes to the politicization of the academia, how government instrumentalizes it, now there are talks about structural changes within this research foundation, for instance, which means that it will allow them in future to filter politically applicants. Thirdly, there is this political censorship that is in the air, because there have been 2 laws which removes the word gender from the syllabus and curriculum, which means that those who teach in gender studies or even in law department gender, so have to censor themselves, or they're target again of these new laws. Then any also kind of queer studies can be targeted as a LGBTQ propaganda with these new laws. And then when it comes to these emancipatory ideas such as even decolonization, peace, or sovereignty, which itself is important, these are important ideas, however we see how the government weaponizes and instrumentalizes these ideas. So what we see is that actually academia is targeted as far as it is part of the civil society, which includes media, academia, NGOs, and so on. So the thing is that there are grievances in the society, there is a discontent, there is a structural economic injustice in the society. And of course, and it's a society, post-conflict society. We have, after the independence, we had several wars. So of course, people do fear the war. So what the government does through its propaganda is that these genuine kind of discontent, grievances, and fears are channeled into phobias and instrumentalized against other oppressed groups, be that LGBTQ community, or you have new kind of culprits, which is civil society. So you channel structural injustice into cultural war. So the government, who is the cause of this structural injustice, is not targeted, and these issues are not addressed. And then you have this cultural war about foreign interests and local interests. And the government claims to represent vernacular kind of local interests, while it is not, because at the same time, through this shock kind of therapy, what they do, they introduce another set of laws as well. For instance, offshore law, which means that it allows Georgia to be the money laundering kind of space. It exempts from taxes those who re-register to Georgia their assets from other offshore zones, and so on and so on. And they plan, for instance, to build more than over than 300 hydropower plants, and these plants are resisted by grassroots movements in Georgia, not NGOs and not academics. They are supporting these grassroots movements, of course, but mainly grassroots movements who are again targeted under this umbrella of the civil society and these laws. So what we see is, on the one hand, while government claims that uses, instrumentalizes without stripping the decolonization, sovereignty, or peace, its real essence, And by instrumentalizing what it does, it claims that it defends local public interests from foreign interests. But actually what it does, it defends itself from the local public interest. And yeah, this is the situation.
Thank you so much for elaborating this. We will definitely also sit with this kind of analysis and think about how to better support you from afar. Now I will have one more question for Zhanar, and I have more questions, but I think that it will be important to open this debate to the public, to the audience. So while Zhanar is talking, if you have burning questions, also start thinking about what you want to ask. So I want to ask you, I was really concerned when you were arrested, and when you were released, I read a piece of reporting that came from Qazaqstan, from fellow Kazakh feminists who reflected on how feminist activism persists despite formidable resistance from both the state and anti-feminist groups. And the text that they wrote ends with the words that meaningful change depends not only on the perseverance of Kazakh feminists, but also on the support they receive within and beyond Kazakhstan. And this made me think, what are the major goals of the decolonial feminist Kazakh movement, and how can we support you? Because sometimes when you're doing solidarity from afar, a lot of harm can be done as well, right? Lots of orientalizing, out of touch sort of ideas and performative activism. So if you can tell us, what ways would you find meaningful for us as allies who are looking at this situation from afar, that we can foster the goals that you actually have?
I just now remembered one case. It was actually for the first time in my activist, work. I'm not in academic field now, although I finished PhD, and I'm really very, passionate about science. But I'm doing more activism. This is my choice, because in my country, this is what I see needed more. So I remember how usually our partners always ask how we can help you, especially partners in the West, which I really respect. And we should have organized our lesbian Kurultai in the form of Euro-Central Asian Lesbian Community Conference in Almaty in 2024. Yes, but US State Department in Biden administration, not Trump administration, they decided that it would be too dangerous, and lesbians, you are too visible, feminita, you are too loud. If you would be attacked, what people say about American money, which will cause impact on all Central Asia and so on. But before, they also were always asking how we can help you, dear Kazakhstani queer feminists and so on. So if you helping us, do it to the end, not like US State Department, which took away, for other activities, $1,000. We lost. So that's why we transform it to lesbian Kurultai. Kurultai from Turkic language means meeting with the really respected, men, white bearded persons with gray hair. So we reowned the word. So that's why it was a lesbian Kurultai. And Feminita, we work with lesbian, bisexual, queer and trans women. So, and it was very interesting case how before we had the negotiations and even signed the contract of this 100,000 money to have this conference, lesbian conference in Kazakhstan. But then they decided, oh no, it's too dangerous. So I would like to ask all our partners, academic allies, to think about Kazakhstan not in the term that already created. I came from Kazakhstan, yes, where I was detained, and there are continuous cases of bullying, hate speech, and so on. But it's better just to come and see what is our country, and then to understand, they do not ride a camel in the city, they live in an apartment. Yeah, because we were colonized. I live in an apartment. I do not move as nomad. I'm not my grandmother. We have water, we have everything. So sometimes this kind of prism that investing in the country would be so dangerous and give impact, what people would think about this Western money and so on, really bothers us, really making us uncomfortable. And what is the result? It was Biden regime. Are we complaining on Trump? I'm complaining on Biden. Left movement in America fail. And leftist people also fail because democracy can be bought, as I see. And Biden didn't risk to what? It's just a piece. It was a piece of money, right? It was not too big to have this conference in Kazakhstan, which were awaited by 200 people from Central Asia. We limited, we did Kurultai, we had 70 only people, but who came, and we have this Kurultai till the end. Although, yes, attacks happened. But when attacks happened, why do you not think about how our president shooting people just because of protest? And why do you think that lesbian conference is dangerous and Bloody January was not dangerous? I live in a reality, and this is my life. If somebody asking, how, what? But this is a reality. If people attack LGBTQI movement, attack our lesbian Kurultai, this is Kazakhstan, where I have to live, and of course we can find another strategy, variants, how to be safe. And for the international community, we just don't ask only money. Of course we ask to, to depict us and understand, maybe probably just visit, because my all words, my beautiful, not beautiful words in English would not describe you the reality in the country. Because we live there, we struggle, we find kindness, joy, pleasure. It's not only about, discrimination, stigma, and everything. I travel in every city, and there is no case that people come and attack me because they recognize me. They come and say thank you. And this is what is Kazakhstan. In 11 years of my activism, nobody came just because they recognized me, oh, this is a lesbian. No, they said thank you. Young people or old people say, I do know you from somewhere. And I say, yes, I'm blogger. Oh, okay, yeah. Let's do photo. This is Kazakhstan, and I would like international community, and I do know, of course, Ukrainian people do know Kazakhstani people, Kazakhstani do know Ukrainian people, not because of past, but because we have many connections in academia, in activism, in many things. So just do not imagine us as something that you really do not know, and then you imagine, probably we will never go there. No, we need you there. We need you here with us.
I was also thinking as you were speaking just how I remember when the full-scale invasion escalated, how Kazakh solidarity with Ukraine was some of the most heartwarming thing I've seen ever. It was so beautiful, the T words, and it was just like incredible. I remember, I just absolutely, and I think a lot of us started having these conversations across Europe, East and Central Asia that we never had before. Which are so important, while I, of course, wish they were happening in a different context, but it has been such a learning curve for a lot of us as well. And I want to say one more thing before I ask you to ask questions. We also have an open letter in support of Kazakh activists on our webpage with Ruta, so do also sign that one. I remember when we were co-writing it with Diana Kudaiberg, and I was thinking like, this is not enough, what else can we do? This is so not enough. And she was telling me, but this is really important because the government really hates negative PR. So please help us give the government the negative PR that it hates and support the activism. So are there any burning questions in the audience, or shall I keep coming up with mine?
Well, something that's come up has been social media propaganda. This is a really big question. So I apologize that it's so unfocused, but I'm just wondering how the kind of structural changes, the structural processes in mass communication, whether it's social media or kind of mainstream mass media, how these processes are both facilitating the kind of proliferation of these authoritarian regimes, but also how, I mean, you know, as we've heard, how they can also facilitate resistance. Thank you.
Who wants to start? Yeah.
Well, the question again is how do these mass social media networks, what can they do to what was I'm sorry, I think I...
Yeah, no, it's kind of how we're seeing, you know, so you know, mass communication is a process and a practice, and we know that it's changing very much. And we also know that, you know, the Trump regime, all of these different regimes use it very actively.
Yes. Okay, very, very good. I understand that. So the fundamental problem is that the best thing that social media has done, particularly, again, during the Maidan and during Ferguson, I think that was a really pivotal moment just globally for how social media was utilized by mass protest movements. The challenge, however, is that social media networks are not regulated. And so that's where the disinformation comes from. So social media democratizes speech. However, it does a very poor job of fact-checking itself. And speaking from America, you know, the best thing that one of our Constitution is that it gave the right to free speech. And of course, the founders did not anticipate Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And so the idea, at least in my thinking, is that speech is supposed to regulate itself. The problem is that in our current environment, it's not. And so that hurts activist movements, right? Because the difference between, say, you bring up Trump and the far right that uses social media effectively versus the more progressive groups among us is that there is a great deal of intellectual integrity that in honesty with which more progressive movements move and when it comes to disseminating information, whereas if you're more right-wing and conservative, it's just shameless. And they just put out everything. And so and particularly in America, it's more critical than saying that Americans lack media literacy. It's just the fact that we have never been conditioned to properly assess what is accurate and what is not beyond our own emotions and feelings. Because prior to the social media movement, prior to 2010, for example, you had the major networks, CNN, NBC, ABC, CBS, et cetera, where you had a director of news at the local level, and then you had a director at the national level that was distilling what type of information was coming out. And so there was a fact-checking process of what we received, and then when social media came into form, that no longer existed anymore because Facebook and Instagram were not conceived to be social media properties with this type of fact-checking rigor. And so that left the rest of us to do that work for ourselves, and we are ill-equipped to do that. Elizabeth Warren, for example, has been moving to regulate social media, but of course that's not happening because social media companies are run by oligarchies. And we see what happened with the Washington Post in regards to Jeff Bezos, who's an oligarch. And so you have these oligarchical powers. By the way, Americans still in media do not use the word oligarch, which in itself is an issue. We ascribe it to countries that are considered developing world, third world countries, America is too big to have oligarchical culture because we're above it. Therefore, it's really challenging for us, for people who are more progressive-minded people in this room, because we don't exist in the, we don't have the infrastructure to counter that. And the best way to really deal with it is really kind of reassessing how we decide to engage, which means that it's going to have to be more in your face, tougher, meaner. Finally, and I, giving people the floor, it's one of the issues with Democrats in the United States. Democrats are not prepared to deal with fascism. Just ill-equipped to deal with fascism and to deal with colonialism, because Democrats have rules. And if they don't have all these rules that you have to follow by, then the Democratic Party is a turn based. It's not your turn yet, right? And so, but I think above all, the major challenge that I think people in the progressive movement have to think about is what does it mean to have so much intellectual strictness in yourself does that possibly hog-tie you to combating these shameless people who have no rules at all? And I think that's a primary problem, and that's how easy the proliferation of disinformation could come about, precisely because we're operating on a different set of rules, which oligarchies in the world take advantage of, because the lack of rules benefit them regardless of where they are in every part of the world.
Thank you so much. Do any of you want to?
So what we usually face in social media, it's a fabric of bots, which our local government actually is buying. They hiring people, and they comment anything you write, especially LGBTQI or pro-Palestine, pro-Ukraine. So they attack you and make your post look like, oh, every person, how to say, quarrel with you, something wrong with this post. So yes, we have that kind of thing, but what we do, usually we do no comment moderation, or we have to block these people, but blocking people manually is so difficult. That is why we not only, for example, Feminita, not only concentrated on Instagram, where already young people said this is a little bit already old-fashioned. They go to TikTok and to another, channels. We often use Telegram for sharing news. And we do know it's not safe. We do know, because Committee of National Security always come to our Fem Picnic or to our event. Even if it was very closed event, they come usually and monitor somewhere. But for us, it's to be in a very hidden chat of Signal where messages disappearing, for example. For us, it's like kind of insult, because we're just sharing news and saying, oh, do you want to go and have just sun warmth in this beautiful day? What is wrong with that? If Committee of National Security would like to come, it's okay. So we started to, not to hide in this Signal disappearing and everything, because it makes, especially young people, because we work with young women, they are a little bit like also frustrated if we have to hide our usual routine. Our usual routine to meet each other, to speak, to drink tea, coffee, sometimes wine, to discuss, say sometimes bad things about men, sorry. Yeah, so we discuss everything. We do say gossip. So that's why we use Telegram. It's not safe. But we also see a lot of disinformation campaign in a very special periods. When, for example, you're preparing something big, like big conference, there are circulating many disinformation campaign in one style, and I would say it's Russian propaganda style, with the very loud man voice, commenting like it's intrigue, something like that. Oh, look at them, they have money, they do USAID project and so on. So it's very even visuals are same. So they share these visuals with anti-gender activists, for example, and they start posting in order to make us non-visible.
Maia, do you want to add anything? You were sort of saying let's have more questions, but I don't think we have time for more questions, so this is more for you to have the last word.
When it comes to social media, it's a powerful resource for both, of course, because considering that official media channels are like TV channels are either pro-government or they belong to some big political economic elite. There is no independent TV channel in Georgia, and they are closing also, shutting down because of the financial crisis, those who have been before. And then you have online media, which is independent media, which is again under threat because of this funding issue, because they have to register as foreign agents and they will not register, so it threatens them. And then you have social media, which could be and is used, but has been used by both sides. And information war is one of the main battlefields. And considering the disinformation, it's very important. It also has very similar parallels, especially when it comes to women politicians, how women protesters are targeted. And it's something, when I was reading disinformation reports from Ukraine and Moldova and in Georgia, it has somehow very, it might sound like conspiracy, but it has the same kind of script when you see how it's targeted. And these anti-gender campaigns especially is something common between these countries. But when it comes to the protests, since we are summing up, I want also to say a few words about how it might evolve in the next months, because at this point we are experiencing a kind of we're at the crossroads, we can say. There is one way of what the government tries also to do is by not listening, not hearing, criminalizing, and so on, as is that people might give up. And because of this also crisis, some people might be forced to migrate from September, like after a few months, which will affect the protest. So there is one way of this Freudian kind of melancholia which paralyzes, but what we are doing, we are grieving the lost object, what we have lost, which is politics, which is democracy. So the thing is that what will be the solution? Either we will remain in melancholia, paralyzed, or the second, also worst case, is that what it calls like, unlike melancholia, you turn to healthy mourning or grieving, which means you just stop thinking about this lost object, which is democracy, and move on. And the third option, which is at stake now, and which we as being in the protest have to do, is how to turn this crisis, how to turn this melancholia into political melancholia, which means how to turn hopelessness, how to hopelessness into transformation. And I think the protest, which is going every day, is this kind of a grieving ritual that does not allow us to close the thing. It does not allow the closure. It reminds us that we have lost democracy, something we never had actually, we never possessed. It's something we aspire. So it's about not forgetting. It's about staying loyal to this democracy. And it's about, through these grieving rituals, protests and so on, remembering, not giving up, not closing this, not moving on, but resisting. So, and it's in some way transformative in a way that last year we had this false hope. Well, it's important to know that we are in the midst of the worst times, in the hopeless times, out of which the politics and real action can happen. So these are the times which does not leave any choice other than action. So this is about transforming this crisis into politically productive transformation, because the old way of living we lived, the old order or the protest or discontent and resistance we used to kind of practice before, they don't work anymore, and we don't have any other choice also other to think about new ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for your words today. I was just thinking, as we spoke about resistance and, transforming crisis into action and also solidarity, it sort of really dawned on me as I was sitting here that Ruta also is this result of solidarity, right? And it's particularly a result of Central Asian and Eastern European solidarity, because this woman over there, Botakoska Simbekova, historian of Eastern Europe, she was the one who actually convinced us to found Ruta at a time when a lot of us in the middle of all the mess didn't really think that, academic association was something that we really urgently needed, and yet we did, and it's amazing what this enables, right? Now we can sit here and have these kind of discussions. So this is also our form of academic and politically activist and artist resistance now. And we again want to invite all of you, if you have ideas for more initiatives, if you want to be more active, this is absolutely welcomed, and please do and resist with us. Thank you.
No, I was simply going to say I'm so happy that we create a space where we don't have to compete with arrogant white men. No, it really is, and so I'm just really happy that our perspectives and views of the world can actually dominate the discourse, because it's very isolating, and this is one of the times where I personally do not feel isolated. Because this field is very isolating, so I'm just really grateful that this, this association exists for all of us, so that we can not resist against the structure as opposed to ourselves and inside of the association, because our perspectives and outlooks on life are the centerpiece of the conversation and not minoritized. So that's
cool. Happy to provide that. Cool. Then let's go and enjoy the rest of the day.